Okay, hello. Chat. Okay, so um, actually, before I start, there have been a number of questions about that I've got about grading of the metaphysics exercises. Um, so I just wanted to emphasize again that uh, the grading of that is quote unquote on a curve. Um, and in particular, you can tell like the median total score now is 13 when at least when I looked earlier today. So, uh, and the typical grades are going to be B plus and A minus, that are like the most common grades. So, if your like total is um, somewhat below 13, you're most likely in the B plus range, and if it's somewhat above 13, you're most likely in the A minus range. That's just roughly speaking. Um, why is my laptop not charging? Hold on 1 second. Now, sorry. So, of course, there will be some straight A's. There will be some B's, B minuses, um, and sometimes there are C's and sometimes not, but there won't be very many. And as I said at the beginning of the class, no one has ever failed that part, the metaphysics exercises, except by just getting zero. um, so, um, so absolutely, when you look at that and you see that you've only got 20% of them right or something, that does not mean you're failing. Um, I can't be more precise than that because I have to wait till all the scores come in to determine what the scale is going to be. But um, yeah, I mean that. Put it this way, that part of the grade doesn't usually drastically lower someone's grade that it would have been based on the writing assignments. It's usually in the same ballpark. Um, okay, now back to Hume. Unless there are any questions about that. Okay. So, so there's two parts of today's reading. Um, Book one, part four, section one, and book one, part four, section two. And I'm just going to talk about the first one and then about the second one. So the first one is about skepticism. With regard to reason. Um, Note, first of all, once again, that although you sometimes hear that modern skeptics, as opposed to ancient skeptics, only doubt about the existence of the outside world, they don't doubt about mathematics and things like that. It's not true. It's not true that Descartes doesn't cast doubt on that in the first meditation, and it's not true that Hume doesn't cast doubt on it, at least in the treatise. Um, um, it's possible that that impression, as I think I suggested before, that that impression about modern skepticism is mostly derived from the fact that that's what Berkeley claims to refute. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but be that as it may. So Hume does in this chapter not only raise doubts, not only about our beliefs with respect to matters of fact, but also with respect to our belief about relations of ideas. Um, and as with any skeptical argument, no, wait, if people's mics aren't, well, that's why I'm not hearing them, because I have my volume turned down. Uh,
Is this best of 7 on this keyboard? What? It's the same as best. So is that best of 9?
okay, so I just muted everyone, but if someone's actually trying to talk to me, you should unmute yourself. Okay. Sorry. So, as with every skeptical argument, um, if we're heading for some kind of radical total doubt, um, then the only way to do it is to use our previous opinions against each other, right? Because obviously, if we can't appeal to some external standard and say, well, according to this standard, all our beliefs are uncertain because you would still have to be certain that that external standard was right. So instead, skeptical arguments always work by uh, taking things you thought you knew before and showing they couldn't both be right, or something like that. So, in particular, Hume's procedure here is to use reason against itself. And the way he uses reason against itself um, is begins with pointing out that after every judgment we make, even if that first direct judgment is based on relations of ideas, right? So for Hume, that means that the opposite of it would be a contradiction. And so it's certainly true, the first direct judgment. He points out that we can never reasonably stop there. We always have to carry out this second reflective judgment, which asks whether we're sure we got the first one right. So, the sense in which reason itself demands that we do this, or it's the same laws of logic that demand that we do this as that established the truth of this judgment. Not sure that's 100% obvious, but it is a reasonable thing to do, at least in some sense of reasonable. And as Hume points out, we certainly act as if it's reasonable, right? Like, so for example, when you do a mathematical calculation, which according to Hume is about relations of ideas, right? So according to Hume, like 1 + 1 = 3 somehow involves a contradiction. Um, um, So 1 plus 1 equal anything other than 2 involves a contradiction. Therefore, 1 plus 1 equals 2 is certainly true because of relations of ideas, according to Hume. So, nevertheless, when we do a long mathematical calculation, um, we are not sure we got the right answer. And we do all kinds of secondary things to make us more sure that the answer is right. Like, for example, we hire someone like an accountant or a competent, as he says. We hire an accountant who's experienced in doing this kind of sum, and we get them to do it. I mean, of course, I guess nowadays we use an electronic accountant or electronic computer. They didn't have those then. But um, so we get someone or something, in our case, that in our experience gets the answer right more often than we do. And not only that, we set up special like checks. I mean, right? Like, so with a human accountant, I don't understand exactly how it works, but those two columns and stuff, and there's some kind of check built into the way you do it, so that if you made a mistake anywhere, the two numbers won't match at the end or something like that, right? And even with electronic computers, we also do things like that. We have checksums and whatever, because although they rarely make a mistake, sometimes they do. Um, I'm actually not even sure if that's relevant or not. I mean, I guess Hume would say that obviously our whole belief in the reliability of mechanical or electronic calculator is all based on experience. It's all reasoning from cause and effect. Well, any case, be that as it may. So in other words, we don't act as if once you carry out that long arithmetic calculation, you can be certain, absolutely certain that you have the right answer. If you could be absolutely certain, then there would be no way of raising or lowering your certainty, and it wouldn't depend on experience or anything like that. Um, and of course, that long calculation was all composed of smaller, more simple calculations. Um, so, uh, or it certainly could have been decomposed into those, right? Like we know there's a familiar algorithm for addition where you only ever have to add one-digit numbers. Um, and if that's too hard, you could rewrite it in binary so that you only ever have to add one and zero. um, right. So, and yet, nevertheless, at the end of it, we're not certain we got the right answer. Therefore, we couldn't have been absolutely certain about all of those steps. Right? Because if we were absolutely certain about every step, then we would have to be absolutely certain about the result of all of them. Um, so, all of that is a way of showing that we think it's reasonable after we've reached a judgment, even one that is supposedly based on relation of ideas and therefore absolutely certain, to take a step back and ask, well, even though I'm certain about it, I know I've been certain before and thought I was basing my judgment on relations of ideas, but afterwards found out that they made a mistake. Um, so this second judgment is about the probability that the first judgment is correct. Um, and this second judgment is never itself a judgment about necessary truth or relation of ideas. The second judgment is always a judgment about matters of fact. Um, right? So, It's always about matters of fact, and therefore it's always reasoning from cause and effect. Our reason must be considered. Sorry, this is uh, Book 1, Part 4, Section 1, Paragraph 1. It's on page 121 in the official class edition. Our reason must be considered as a kind of cause of which truth is the natural effect, but such a one as by the irruption of other causes and by the inconstancy of our mental powers may frequently be prevented. Right? Prevented means like, here means like impeded, prevented from having its usual effect. Um, so this is just like, if you see smoke coming out of a building and you infer that there's a fire inside the building, um, you know, that conclusion has a certain probability, and how probable it is depends on how often you've found that smoke implies, that when there's smoke, there's fire, right? And, you know, uh, you've seen or heard of such things as like smoke machines or whatever, so you're absolutely certain, but you're pretty certain. Usually, when smoke is coming out, that means there's a fire inside. So that's the same thing that happens here. I do a simple arithmetic calculation. I know that I have sometimes been wrong about that. Actually, this is a true story. On my before I was in philosophy, I tried to get a PhD in astrophysics, and I got as far as passing the qualifying exams. So the qualifying exams were oral. So it was like me standing at a blackboard and these like professors asking me questions, and I had to work them out on the blackboard. And I was so nervous that I added 7 and 5, and I got the wrong answer. So one of them was like, you might want to recheck that. So anyway, right. So I know that there have been times when I did a very simple arithmetic calculation and I got it wrong. Not often, but that means that in this second judgment, based on cause and effect, I adjust my confidence in the result of the first judgment down from certainty to probability. So instead of just, I mean, and Hume says, and this seems plausible, that actually probability and certainty are completely different. Even the highest probability is not really the same kind of thing as certainty, right? Like before I took this second judgment, I just thought that the answer was whatever, 12. But now, after this second judgment, I tend to think strongly that it's 12, but that's not the same thing as thinking it's 12. Right? So, anyway, so that second judgment reduces that first direct judgment, which, because it's based on relation of ideas, wouldn't have been a matter of probability. After the second judgment, it becomes a matter of probability. Now, so far, this is not skepticism. That is, I guess it depends what you mean by skepticism. If you say, as Locke does, that knowledge involves absolute certainty, and that anything that doesn't involve absolute certainty is not knowledge, but opinion or judgment, and you define skepticism as the view that we have no knowledge, then I guess you could say this is already skepticism. Right? It says that in Locke's terms we have no knowledge but only judgment, or what's usually called opinion. But so far as it goes, it's if that's how you define skepticism, then skepticism isn't so bad, right? I mean, it's okay to go around and say, well, I'm 99.99% certain of lots of things, but I don't have any knowledge in that strict sense. That would be okay. Um, so Hume wants to push it towards a much more radical conclusion, which is that um, we can't attach any probability at all to any of our beliefs. So that would mean that there's no difference between believing that 1 plus 1 equals 2 and believing the most far-fetched things that I don't really believe at all. They all have probability 0. And that kind of skepticism, if I believed it, would make obviously any kind of thought or action impossible. Um, so how do we get to that extreme conclusion, starting with this relatively mild one? So, like, the way it works is, here's our original judgment. One plus one equals 2. And now we've just argued that to be reasonable, we must carry out a second judgment. So the second judgment is judgment 1 was probably done right. Where um, by done right, I mean I probably really compared the ideas I intended to compare and noticed the features of them that I thought I'd noticed. Um, uh, so if I did that in a matter of relations of ideas, I couldn't be wrong. But the question is, did I really do that, or did I, through distraction or confusion or whatever, think I was looking at the relations of the ideas, but actually I wasn't, right? So that's what would happen, you know, uh, if I suddenly for a moment thought 1 plus 1 equals 3. Um, so right? So the second judgment is that probably didn't happen because my reason doesn't, is usually pretty reliable in simple matters like this. It would take a lot to distract me or confuse me sufficiently that I wouldn't get the right answer to 1 plus 1. Um, so the second judgment is that judgment 1 was probably done right. Now, so like this is the x-axis here is the number of judgments, right? So like this is judgment 1, this is judgment 2, but I'm kind of already giving away how the argument's going to work. There's going to be more judgments after judgment 1 and judgment 2. But, and here's the probability of the y-axis is the probability of judgment 1. So after I just did judgment one, after I just did judgment one, the probability of judgment one was 1 because it's relations of ideas, so it's absolutely certain. But now judgment 2 comes along and says, well, you probably did that right, but maybe you made a mistake. So after judgment 2, I go back and correct my impression of how probable it is that judgment 1 is true. Right? By probability of judgment 1, I mean the probability that judgment 1 is true. Right? So I go back and correct it, and I say, well, although, when I was thinking the judgment, I was certain, I now realize that that could be consistent, that certainty could be consistent with being wrong. It's probably not, but I should reduce my estimation of its probability a little bit. And then we have a third judgment. Now, I mean, why does there have to be a third judgment? Well, if it was reasonable to have a second judgment, it's going to be reasonable to have a third judgment, right? I mean, this judgment here, also is a judgment that could be done right or wrong. So this judgment here, I mean, this is a judgment of matter of the fact. It concluded probability, not certainty. But nevertheless, I can conclude probability right, or I can get it wrong. So I have to step back and say, well, how reliable are my judgments about the reliability of my judgments? So the third judgment is that judgment 2 was probably done right. So the third judgment says, well, given the case I was thinking about and whatever, I think my estimate of that kind of probability that's that high is probably pretty good. But Hume points out this is a real question, right? I mean, if you've, well, I guess this is among the things that some people think have just been discovered by psychology, but as you can see from Hume, they haven't just been discovered, right? Namely, that sometimes we're overconfident and sometimes we're underconfident in our abilities. So, like if you ask someone, how reliable are your judgments of arithmetic results? Depending on who you ask and what mood they're in, they may overestimate or underestimate their reliability. And there's no surprise in that. That's something we already know about ourselves, basically, or should know if we're reasonable, right? So we need this third judgment to estimate how likely it is that the second judgment was right. Now, I mean, this doesn't directly affect our estimate of the probability of the first judgment. In fact, it's not clear how it should change it on the face of it, because if our judgment here is, I mean, maybe our judgment here is that, maybe I say, well, actually, I tend to be underconfident about things like that. I know from experience. So first judgment was probably, so this one was probably an underestimate. So that I should raise this. But Hume says that this third judgment will always lower the probability farther. And why does he think that? I mean, this is what he says. It's back on the very next page. Um, but this decision, so sorry, this is paragraph 6. But this decision, though it should be favorable to our preceding judgment, being founded only on probability, must weaken still further our first evidence. So why is he saying that? When I just argued that, no, maybe sometimes it will increase our first evidence. But I think what he's saying is that, whichever way this comes out, is going to be sort of like the mean of a probability distribution, right? That's what judgments of probability are like. So when I say, these judgments tend to be off in such and such a way, I'm what I'm really saying is, you know, this is how they're distributed. This many of them are too high. This many of them are too low, and the mean is that they're a little bit too high or a little bit too low or whatever. Um, but uh, but even if the mean result is for this one to get higher, the worst case has gotten worse, right? That is, um, I've I've realized that there's some finite probability that this judgment was much less likely to be done correctly than I thought. So if I just ask, how confident am I in the first judgment? I think this is the way Hume is thinking of it. Whether this is the right way of thinking it, I'm not 100% sure. It's a little confusing. But I think, so the way Hume is thinking of it is basically, it's like this third judgment extends the error bars on the first judgment. And so if you ask, like, how certain can I be that it's right? The lower bound of that is always going down. And you can't be more confident than the lower bound. Um, so the third, I think that's what he means by saying, again, what he said was, well, the page is already flipped, so I'm not going to, but, what he said was, even if this judgment should be favorable, um, simply because it's a judgment of probability, it must serve to weaken our first conclusion. That's the way I understand that. So, so the third judgment makes the probability of the first judgment go down a little bit. And then obviously you can see where this is going. We have to ask it, you have to raise a fourth, you have to make a fourth judgment about the reliability of the third judgment, and so on and so forth. And Hume says, therefore, the initial certainty will be reduced to zero. Somewhere in one of these judgments out here, this will go down to zero. Wait, why does it have to go down to zero? Couldn't it kind of asymptotically approach zero? I mean, not that that would be a great result for our knowledge or anything, but I think it's actually important for Hume that if this worked, we would reach zero in a finite number of steps. Why does he think that? Well, This is in that same paragraph 6 that I was reading from before, book 1, part 4, section 1, paragraph 6. No finite object can subsist under a decrease repeated in infinitum. And even the vastest quantity which can enter into human imagination must in this manner be reduced to nothing. So that is, I think Hume believes that it is not actually possible for this to approach zero asymptotically. And if you say, but isn't it an obvious matter of geometry, or arithmetic or something? Well, I guess it's an obvious matter of geometry or real arithmetic, the arithmetic of the continuous line, that it is possible for a function to approach zero asymptotically and never get to it. Well, Hume doesn't think that about actual geometry, right? We remember that from last time. He thinks that this actual line here is composed of a finite number of indivisible parts. So once the function has reached one part, if it continues to decrease after that, it will go to zero. Now, I mean, it's not obvious that that conclusion about the diagram can be transferred over to a conclusion about certainty, right? I mean, certainty is not actually the length of some line. It's, according to Hume himself, is a kind of intensity or vividness of an idea. So to make this argument work, Hume must believe that this is true not only of extension, but that it's true of intensive quantity as well, right? Like the intensity of something must can't continuously increase or decrease. There must be some smallest amount of difference in intensity. But I think he does believe that, even though, I mean, not just from here, but from other places where he talks about intensities. I think he does believe that, and moreover, I think he thinks in general, even in a non-quantitative sense, there can't be a continuous progression from one thing to another. If you look back in the discussion of the shade of blue example, he just offhand argues there that there can only be a finite number of different shades of blue. It can't vary continuously from green to purple. So why he thinks that, I mean, I'm not aware of a place he gives a general argument for it. But it seems to be something which he believes about the kind of order an infinite number of things can be put in, and in particular, whether an infinite number of things can ever reach a limit. And I mean, it's not actually surprising that Hume and a lot of philosophers have thought that an infinite number of things can never reach a limit, because infinite means no limit. All right. So anyway, this is what Hume thinks, and therefore, if we were completely reasonable, because remember, it's supposed to be the same principles of reason that move us from one judgment to the next, to the next, to the next. If we were completely reasonable, we would continue this series, and we would eventually get to zero, no matter what degree of probability we started with, even absolute certainty. Okay, so why don't we do that? So, I mean, first of all, Hume says we evidently don't do that. That is, we evidently believe some things and not others, and among the things we believe some more strongly than others. So, um, we're not entirely reasonable, and all our beliefs depend on the fact that we're not entirely reasonable. Um, they all depend on some other order of ideas besides the order of reason. That is, like, from Locke's point of view, they're all due to madness. And the other order of ideas is what Hume and Locke and Spinoza and others call the order of the imagination, right? The way ideas follow from each other, but not according to the rules of reason, but for other reasons. So, um, and in this case, so there's some interfering principle, which I think just by definition is a principle of the imagination. Um, there's some interfering principle which keeps us from doing this, even though our reason informs us that we should do it. We don't do it. What is it? Well, I think in order to make it work, Hume applies exactly the same principle about things going to zero in a finite number of steps again. But this time, he says it works this way, that although um, reason tells us based on the same principle to do the same thing every time, the farther we get away from a direct judgment, and the more we get into of probabilities of probabilities, the harder it is to focus on what we're thinking about. And because it's hard to focus on what we're thinking about, it doesn't have the same force. So, like I said, that's a principle of the imagination, which, I mean, you don't have to try to figure out what the image that's involved is or something. It's just like, it's something that makes our ideas more or less vivid, other than the laws of logic or even the laws of reasoning based on cause and effect, the laws of probable reasoning. It's some other thing that makes our ideas more or less vivid. And in this case, it's the abstruseness or indirectness of the judgment that makes the conclusion less vivid. And although Hume doesn't say this, I think what he must think is that this reduction in the force of the new judgment happens much faster than this reduction in the probability of the first judgment. So if instead of the probability of judgment number one, I were to graph here the force of judgment, whatever judgment we're at. So the first time, the force is 1, right? Like 1 plus 1 equals 2, I believe it. It's very vivid. For the second one, this one was probably right, but not 100% right, has less effect. The conclusion is less vivid. I don't believe it as strongly. And because I don't believe the second judgment as strongly, it doesn't reduce the certainty of the first judgment as much as it should. If it were as strong as the first judgment, if it were as vivid as the first judgment. So instead of reducing it to here, it only reduces it to here. And then, as I said, I think Hume must believe, and this is pretty reasonable. I mean, we often carry out this second judgment, right? Like second guess ourselves, first conclude something and then be like, well, but how sure am I did that right? We sometimes carry out this third judgment, although it's already like harder to think about. I think Hume is right. How reliable are my judgments about how confident I should be about my judgments? After that, we barely ever think these things. And it's hard to keep track of what we're asking anymore. I mean, I can write, the fourth judgment would be judgment 3 is probably right. But then if you fill in what judgment 3 is and what judgment 2 is, you get some really long, complicated thing, and it's hard to be sure I even understand it. So I think Hume is probably right to say, at least if he's right about what belief is and so forth, he's probably right to say the vividness of these judgments declines very fast. It goes to zero a long time before this would go to zero, the probability of judgment 1. And therefore, because of that irrational principle of belief, it's only that irrational principle of belief that saves reason from destroying itself. And so the conclusion is, so Hume says we can't believe the skeptical conclusion. No matter how much reason impels us to believe it, we can't believe it and we won't believe it. And this is why. But you might ask then, well, what's the point of going through this whole skeptical argument, Hume? Right? Like, what's the point of going through an argument if you know that we can't believe it? And I think in this case, unlike the case about skepticism about the senses, I think in this case he thinks we can't believe it even momentarily. Right? We can never entertain the idea that all of our beliefs have probability 0. So, so what's the point of making this argument if you know the conclusion is not going to be believed even for an instant? And I think the answer is that although we can't believe that, there is something else, according to Hume, that we can believe. Where is it? So this is Book 1, Part 4, Section 1, Paragraph 9. It's on page 123 in the other edition. My intention, then, in displaying so carefully the arguments of that fantastic sect, that is, of the extravagant skeptics who claim that you should and that they do suspend judgment about everything. Hume says they're wrong. They don't suspend judgment about everything. But anyway, I guess that's why they're a fantastic sect, right? They're like, it's a fantasy. So anyway, my intention then in displaying so carefully the arguments of that fantastic sect is only to make the reader sensible of the truth of my hypothesis, that all our reasons concerning causes and effects are derived from nothing but custom, and that belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. Right? So the whole point of this was to get you to realize that Hume's theory of belief is correct. And Hume's theory of belief, remember, is that belief is an impression. That's why the mind doesn't have authority over it the way it has authority over its ideas. I mean, I know we saw Hume's theory of belief in the Enquiry, and this is the Treatise, but he has the same theory of belief more or less in the Treatise. So Hume's theory of belief was that belief is an impression, that is, it's like a sensation. It's the way a certain idea strikes us. We have no choice in the matter. We're not responsible. It's something that happens to us. And so this digression about skepticism with respect to reason is to point out to you that if that weren't the case, if we really could be like rationally responsible for all our beliefs, we wouldn't be able to believe anything. They would all go to zero. And Hume apparently thinks that although we can't believe the skeptical conclusion, we can believe that, namely, that we're not responsible for our beliefs, that they're things that happen to us, that it has to do with the sensitive part of our nature. Whether that's true that we can believe that conclusion or not, I think is a good question. I think part of Kant's strategy at this point is to deny that we can believe that, or at the very least to deny that we could correctly believe that as the conclusion of some argument, which is what Hume has just tried to get us to do. Um, um, okay, that's all I want to say about skepticism with regard to reason. Are there questions about that? Okay, no. So I'll go on to skepticism with respect to the senses. Um, so in this case, as in the previous case, Hume, well, no, I shouldn't say it. Hume begins his discussion of skepticism with respect to the senses by saying that, as in the previous case, we won't actually believe the result. We always will believe in bodies no matter what. Do you understand why this is about bodies, right? Skepticism with respect to the senses is skepticism about whether the things we perceive by the senses are there, and the things we perceive by the senses are supposedly extended things, bodies, right? So Hume says we're always going to believe in bodies no matter what. So he says, like just as in the previous chapter, you shouldn't think that I'm arguing this in order to convince you not to believe in it. Rather, I'm interested in explaining why we believe in it and showing that the reason we believe in it is not due to reason. We don't rationally believe in bodies. So, however, by the time we get to the end of the section, things start to sound a little bit different. So, so this is paragraph 56, book 1, part 4, section 2, paragraph 56. It's on page 140, starts on page 143 in the other edition. Having thus given an account of all the systems, both popular and philosophical, with regard to external existences, I cannot forbear giving vent to a certain sentiment. Now this, we're going to see a lot more of this in the reading for next week. It's a strange thing. It's similar to what Descartes does in the Meditations. There's like a fiction here. Hume is writing as if we're like listening in on his train of thought, and like as he writes this paragraph here, it's like for the first time he's had the train of thought that happened in the other paragraphs, and this is what he's feeling, and now he's going to give vent to it. Whereas, of course, obviously, he wrote this stuff, edited it, rearranged it, had plenty of time to have all kinds of different sentiments. So this is a fiction. But okay, so here's the fiction. I cannot forbear giving vent to a certain sentiment which arises upon reviewing those systems. I begun this subject with premising that we ought to have an implicit faith in our senses, and that this would be the conclusion I should draw from the whole of my reasoning. But to be ingenuous, right? So to be ingenuous means to be honest, but he's not being honest. Hume is such a tricky author, and this is a perfect example of it. To be right, he's not being honest. If he were being honest, he could always go back and rewrite the beginning of the section before the book is published, right? He doesn't have to leave it the way it is if he's changed his mind in between. So again, this is part of this fiction. But to be ingenuous, I feel myself at present of a quite contrary sentiment, and am more inclined to repose no faith at all in my senses, or rather imagination, than to place in it such an implicit confidence. Right? So this argument actually ends up having a somewhat different effect, according to Hume, than the other one. And I think the point of this fiction, as with Descartes' fiction, is to kind of model for us how we should react to the argument, right? So that we can like identify with Hume's sentiments, right? So the effect of the argument on us, he's saying, and on anyone, at least typically, is going to be different from the effect of the first argument, with the argument with respect to reason. In the argument with respect to reason, we can follow the argument, but we just don't believe the conclusion at all. It doesn't affect the way we still keep on, believing and not believing things exactly the way we always did. Whereas this one, when we get to the end of it, we're like, wow, so I really shouldn't believe in bodies then. But then Hume says, in the end, the result is the same. It's only as long as I focus on the conclusion of this argument that I can hold on to this thought that I shouldn't believe in the existence of bodies. As soon as I relax my concentration and go out and do other stuff, the old belief will come back. So it's not a huge difference, but it's an important difference. And I think it's because of the difference in the nature of the conclusions of the two arguments. The first argument simply claims to show that you should reduce the probability of your initial belief, and reduce it again and again and again down to zero. But the argument of section 2 claims to show that the way we naturally believe in the existence of external things is definitely wrong. Not just that it's not as certain or something like that, but it offers an argument for why we're wrong to believe that. So that's a lot harder to brush off, at least momentarily. Okay, so before I discuss how this argument works, it's important to emphasize right away that there's two different, so this is skepticism with regard to the senses means with regard to or with respect to the objects of the senses, that is, bodies, right? So skepticism doesn't mean skepticism about whether I have senses or something like that. It means skepticism about the existence of the objects of the senses, that is, bodies. Um, um, Skepticism about their continued existence, even when I don't perceive them, and about their existence independent of the mind. So that's what skepticism with regard to the senses means. And then the important thing I have to point out is that Hume, throughout, I mean, sometimes he's considering one more than the other, but throughout has in mind two different ways of understanding what the objects of the senses would be if they existed, and therefore different ways of understanding what skepticism about them would be, like what it would be a doubt about. So, and the two views are called the view of the vulgar and the view of philosophers. There's also a third view, which he is not identical to either of these, which he doesn't discuss, which is Berkeley. But let me say what these two are and then explain why Berkeley isn't one of them. So the view of the vulgar is that what philosophers call impressions, that is, the things that are immediately present to the mind in sense perception, are the objects of the senses. There's no other objects. And so vulgar here, by the way, right? Vulgar here just means common. It doesn't mean like bad-mannered or something like that. It just means common. It can have a negative connotation, but only in the same way that common can have a negative connotation, right? Like, oh, that's so common. If you're like an upper class British person, I guess, or whatever. So anyway, and I mean that's important because this, by calling this the vulgar view, Hume doesn't actually mean to disparage it really, or to say that it's characteristic of some other, like the unwashed or something. Actually, he says over and over that philosophers also hold this vulgar view most of the time when they're not thinking about it. Philosophers also are the vulgar view. So, and again, the vulgar view is that what I'm seeing is what's there. So, and the reason to call that an impression is because, remember, again, impression is for Hume what ideas of sensation or reflection are for Locke. That is, they're immediate objects of the mind. And if I think that I see things immediately and not by way of something else that's in between me and those things, then that means I think the things that I see are immediate objects of the mind, that is, they're impressions, right? So the vulgar believe that external objects are impressions. Now, why isn't that the same as Berkeley, you might ask? Well, it's not the same with Berkeley because, unlike Berkeley, the vulgar do believe that external objects exist even when I'm not perceiving them and exist independently of the mind. So the vulgar believe that impressions themselves exist even when I'm not perceiving them. Right? So, in other words, if I'm looking at this, I think I see this directly. I close my eyes, I open my eyes, I think I see it, the same thing directly again, and I think it was there the whole time. So I think that the immediate object of my mind in perception continues to exist even after the perception stops. The very thing that was immediately present to my mind is still there when my eyes are closed. And that's why when I open my eyes again, I see it again. It's again immediately present to my mind because impressions themselves don't depend on the mind for their existence. So, of course, that's not the same as Berkeley. That's something Berkeley thinks is absurd. It's a contradiction in terms. But Hume says this is what we all believe most of the time. And as soon as we stop thinking really hard about these matters, we go back to believing it. So that's the view of the vulgar, whereas the view of philosophers is that external objects are represented by impressions. Right? So the view of the philosophers is that what's immediately present to my mind when I look at something like this pen, you know, I was using my laptop as the thing before, but I realized you can't see that. Right? So we use the pen. So, you know, what's immediately present to my mind in perception is not is something that only exists during perception, and it depends on my mind for its existence. It's what Locke would call an idea. And again, you know, it's just a terminological difference here. Hume doesn't call those kind of things ideas. He calls them impressions, and he only calls the other kind of Locke's ideas, the fainter copy ones, ideas. But, you know, I'm sorry that's confusing, but that's the way it is. But the point is, it's that thing that is immediately present to the mind and perception is something that depends on the mind for its existence. It only exists in the mind. And it only exists, it depends on the mind's operation of perception for existence. It only exists as long as I'm perceiving it. Okay, that sounds like the philosophers agree with Berkeley now, because the philosophers are saying that this thing that I see immediately is gone when I close my eyes. It's not there anymore. When I open my eyes, there's a new one. It's different. It's a different one. However, the philosophers, and the main philosopher here is Locke, right? I mean, not that other philosophers like Descartes and whatever don't agree with this, but it's Locke that Hume is mostly thinking of, I think. So the philosophers don't agree with Berkeley because although they say that the thing that's immediately present to my mind and perception goes away when I close my eyes and is dependent on the mind for its existence, they think there's something else. The immediate object that's represented by that impression that doesn't depend on my mind for existence and that is still there when I close my eyes. So the vulgar and philosophers agree that there's something that is an object of the senses that continues to exist even when I'm not perceiving it and that exists independently of my mind, but they disagree about what that thing is. The vulgar say it's the impression itself, And the philosophers say, no, it's something else that's represented by the perception. So skepticism with respect to this view will be doubting whether the impressions themselves continue to exist when I'm not perceiving them and exist independently of the mind. Whereas skepticism about this will be doubting whether the impressions correctly represent something other than them, which continues to exist when I'm not perceiving it and exists independently of the mind. I guess I should say one other thing about the view of the philosophers. According to Hume, the philosophers believe that this external object resembles the impressions. It resembles the impressions in, I guess you'd have to say, at least some respect if we're thinking about Locke, right? Like Locke doesn't think, doesn't take the view that Hume takes when he's not going through this argument, which is that the external thing exactly resembles impressions, right? So it has color and whatever, just like the impressions do. But Locke does think there's a certain resemblance or analogy between the order of impressions and the external order. So there's a way in which the impressions resemble the external things, and because of that they're able to represent them. Sorry, I have a question from the home audience. Class is over at 6:55.
It says on now that your class is over at 6:25.
Okay, that's wrong. All right. Okay, so and that's important because, you know, what I just said about how the philosophers disagree with Berkeley was not 100% correct. It depends how you understand it. But I mean, the truth is, Berkeley does think that my ideas represent something external that is their cause, that continues to exist, even, or that are what Hume calls my impressions, right? My real ideas is what Berkeley calls them. Berkeley thinks that my impressions do represent something that causes them, that isn't dependent on my mind for its existence, and that continues to exist even when I'm not perceiving, namely the divine will. Right? So there actually is something, some external object, according to Berkeley, that's represented by my impressions. However, the difference was, and I argued this in detail when I talked about Berkeley, that Berkeley thinks the divine will doesn't resemble my impressions. That is, that the power to cause a given impression is a bare power. We can't conclude anything about the structure of the divine will from the order and connection of our impressions. Okay, so so that's a more accurate way of saying how the philosophers disagree with Berkeley. And when you put it this way, I think you can see why Hume just leaves Berkeley out of consideration in this whole discussion, because that view, namely that there's an external cause of our impressions that they represent, but which doesn't resemble them at all, Hume has already argued previously makes no sense, as he points out here. This is, switch back to the document camera. For as to the notion of external existence, when taken for something specifically different from our perceptions, we have already shown its absurdity. This is pronounced shown, by the way. The spelling has changed, not the pronunciation. All right. We have already used to be spelled like so. SEW. All right. Anyway, for as to the notion of external existence, when taken for something specifically different from our perceptions, we have already shown its absurdity. Right? Specifically different from our impressions means as opposed to numerically distinct. Right? Two things can be numerically distinct even though they resemble each other in every respect. So Hume is saying that it's absurd to think that our impressions and their objects are more distinct than that. Not only numerically distinct, but don't resemble each other at all. And that's Berkeley's view, and so Hume is not considering it again. Okay, so in order to take these views on, Hume in this section spends most of his time on this one, explaining how we get to this one, showing that it's not rational, and finally arguing that reason shows the conclusion to be false. And then at the very end of this section, he explains where the philosopher's view comes from, and he shows that the philosopher's view has nothing to recommend it except that it's a reaction to the refutation of the vulgar view, but it's not a rational reaction to it. Right? So to say this one is certainly false, and there's no reason to believe this one. In the next two sections, section 3 and section 4, he's going to go more into detail on the philosopher's view. He's going to take the two main versions of it he's aware of and show in those cases there's not only no reason to believe in it, but that they're incoherent, right? So that they're unintelligible. So, I mean, actually, as far as the known versions of this, they're going to turn out especially bad. But as far as this view in general, all he shows in the end is there's no reason to believe it. That there isn't even a tendency of the imagination in its favor if we actually reject this one. Okay, so the main point is to explain his reaction to this one. You can talk more about what he says about the philosopher's view next time. So in order to explain this one, he separates what the vulgar believe about the external impressions, and I've already said this several times. The vulgar believe in the continued existence of our impressions, that is, that they continue to exist even when we're not perceiving them, and in their distinct, so actually, I wrote independent here. Actually, he says distinct, and there's two parts to it. One is external position, like I believe they're outside of me. This is a little bit unclear what it means, as he himself points out as he goes on, I think, and there must be something important about it, or else he wouldn't go into it. But I'm not sure I understand why he does. This is definitely the more interesting and important one, I think. So that they exist independently of the mind, right? That is not just outside of the mind in space or somewhere, right? But that the mind isn't necessary for them to exist. The mind's perception of them isn't necessary for their existence. They can exist on their own. And he asks about these two. He asks about each of them. could our belief in it be due to the senses? Could it be due to reason? Or is it due to something else? And again, I think it's kind of by definition that if it's due to something else, it's due to the imagination, right? Like something that makes an idea more vivid that's not reason is imagination. So that our belief in these is due to reason, he disposes of pretty quickly because, and it's by the argument that should be familiar from Locke, like little children believe in the external existence of external objects, peasants and whatever believe. I don't think he mentions idiots actually, but he could. All these people who don't have the use of their reason or don't have the full use of their reason would be, so they would be expected to have no belief or a weak belief in this if it were due to reason, but we find that they don't, I guess. So we know that for sure. There's these psychological arguments that are supposed to show when the baby starts to believe in object permanence. But I don't know that those experiments can tell the difference between the baby believing that the thing continues to exist while it doesn't perceive it versus the baby expecting for sure to perceive it again under certain circumstances, which is the distinction we have to make here. But in any case, be that as it may, reason gets ruled out quickly. What about the senses? And basically, the argument with respect to the senses is the same for both of these. The argument is it can't be due to the senses because, and again, I think this is kind of a matter of definition. The senses are, by definition, only acting insofar as we have some individual impression. That's what the senses are. The faculty of sense is the ability to have impressions. But the idea that something exists when I'm not perceiving it is an idea. It's not. The impression's gone. And therefore, whatever makes that more vivid can't be the impression that I had before. The whole point is the impression is gone. So it must be something else. And since it's not reason, it must be the imagination. Okay, so, I mean, that part of the argument turns out to actually have less content than you might think, right? I mean, the main point is there's some tendency of our ideas to become more vivid or less vivid or whatever that doesn't operate by rational argument, and that is somehow responsible for these beliefs. So, to figure out why this happens, Hume tries to narrow down when it happens. Which impressions do we vulgarly form this belief about? The belief of continued and independent existence. So he says, like, for example, we don't believe that about pains and pleasures. Now, I'm not, so all these philosophers and many other philosophers agree with that. Obviously, we all know that when we stick our hand in a fire, the pain isn't in the fire. It's only in the mind. So the first part is definitely true. We don't think the pain is in the fire. But the second part, don't we kind of think the pain is in the hand? I think, there's something to be said for that. And, similarly, the way all these philosophers assume that tastes and smells are not, strictly speaking, in a place, don't we kind of think the tastes are in our mouth? We don't think the taste is in the fruit, even when we're not tasting it. But we do think that when we're tasting it, it's somewhere, namely in our mouth. Well, anyway, that's just, Hume doesn't really consider that, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But so Hume says, we don't believe this about pains, pleasures, passions. We do believe this vulgarly about both primary qualities and secondary qualities. We believe they have this continued independent existence. Why is that? What's the difference between the impressions we take to be independent of our mind versus the impressions we take to be merely in our mind and only existing as long as perceived? And he thinks about three possible differences. Number one, some are involuntary and some are voluntary. Number two, some have superior force than others. This list comes from Berkeley, presumably. He says the involuntariness and superior force things are not right. The pain doesn't have less force than the color of the fire. It has more force, but we still don't attribute it to the external body. Involuntariness, the pain isn't less voluntary or isn't more voluntary than the color. So then he considers the third thing on Berkeley's list, which is regularity. And he separates that into two parts, constancy and coherence. So constancy means that I can reliably get the same impression back again, right? Like if I'm looking at this and then I close my eyes, I know how to get it back, open my eyes, and there it will be again, exactly the same or almost the same. So Hume says the impressions that we take to be external objects, remember Vulgar, we take them to be the external objects, are the ones that have that property of constancy. And he says more than that, they also have a certain property of coherence with each other, which is, roughly speaking, that even when they do change, they change according to rules, right? So, like, if I close my eyes and when I open them, I don't see the pen anymore, there's a rule that certain kind of other things must have happened. Something must have moved the pen. Those two things put together that amount to a greater regularity in those impressions, and somehow that's related to our forming this belief. How do we know it's related? So far, just by empirical observation, we've noticed that this is the characteristic that marks out the ones we believe this about. Now, that's the way it seems, but actually, and this is important, on a closer view, Hume points out that what's really going on here is not so much that these impressions have greater regularity. It's rather that they have a certain kind of intermediate regularity. Because, as he says when he talks about this in more detail, our passions do follow each other in a certain order. It may not be a perfect order, but there's definitely a coherence between them. I know that right after I feel really angry, the next instant I'm not going to feel really happy. Certain things have to change, or at least that won't happen unless there's other changes. So there's actually a lot of regularity there. And meanwhile, if you go back to my example, So I said certain things must have happened. What does that mean? So, or like take Hume's example. I'm facing away from the door and I hear the sound of a door turning on its hinges. So Hume says, I never have observed that this noise could proceed from anything but the motion of a door. That's the regularity. But actually, and Hume is well aware of this and goes on to point it out, basically, but you have to pay attention to notice that he's doing it. Actually, nothing could be further from the case, and the example right now is a perfect example. I heard the noise, and I didn't see a door turning. So I have experienced the noise without seeing a door turning. So actually, Hume says the difference between these impressions and the passions is that they have a certain regularity only if you fill in some missing pieces. Right? That is the rule that every time there's that noise, there's also the visible impression of a door moving, is only true if you fill in some extra visible impressions of door moving that I don't perceive. And that is what gives rise to the belief in continued existence of impressions. Somehow, and I see that I'm running out of time to explain in detail, I'm going to have to talk about this at the beginning next time because it's too important to just leave out. But I'll try to get it set up as much as I can in the next 2 minutes. So somehow, the fact that this type of impression, sounds, sights, tactile impressions, whatever, is not regular enough, but can be made more regular by this belief in continued existence. Right? So if I believe that the door that I saw before is still there, even though I'm not seeing it, then the rule doesn't have an exception. So somehow the fact that these impressions are not regular enough and can be made regular only by this belief is what produces the belief. And the last thing I want to say about this, because without it you can't understand why he's going to set up this, why there's a problem here, and also I think can't understand what the refutation of the vulgar view is in the end, is that you might think, oh, I see, this is just an example of your usual principle, Hume. I acquire from custom. I've seen the door moving at the same time as I heard that sound so many times before that now by habit I associate the two. And when I hear the sound, the idea of the doors visible moving becomes more vivid because of that association, and that's why I believe it. But Hume says that can't account for it. And the reason it can't account for it is that, well, think about it. How often have I seen those two things, have I experienced those two impressions together? Exactly as often as I actually was looking at the door when it moved. So the extent of that regularity, which is going to give rise to the custom, is exactly as regular as the impressions actually are. But we just said the impressions are not perfectly regular. On the contrary, Sometimes I'm not looking at the door and I hear the sound and I don't see the door moving. However many exceptions like that there are, that's how much my degree of association should be lowered, and therefore my degree of belief should be lowered. And that's exactly the degree of belief that I need to be added to believe in this continued existence. Right? So, in other words, I can't conclude from my having most of the time seen these things go together that they always go together. Rather, what I would conclude by the ordinary principles of reasoning from cause and effect is that they mostly go together, and that's what I already knew. How do we get this extended regularity? That's the puzzle, and like I said, I'll have to talk about that at the beginning next time.